book that I haven't read quite yet called The Inside Out Revolution. What Michael Neill brings to us today is fantastic. It's an incredible energy for us to really kind of settle in, slow down, and yet find new levels of productivity and success that maybe we haven't tapped into yet. It's just a little tidbit more about Michael. His books have been translated into 17 languages. His videos, TEDx Talk has been viewed by over 150,000 people around the world. So it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Michael Neill onto the Thriving Launch podcast.
Welcome to the show. Are you ready to launch?
I am ready.
You know, this topic is just so near and dear to my heart because I think that living a guided life is the only way I really know how to move through my life. It's what's most important. I know Luis.
And as entrepreneurs, that's something that we can get really lost in, as people who are trying to find our mission and share something with the world and get our message out there. It can be really easy for us to get headstrong or wrapped up in how we have to do it or how it has to happen. And one of the practices I go back to is finding a way to listen and to be guided. And that's something I'm excited and really feel passionate to dive in with you today, Michael.
Yeah, for me, it is really fundamental. People kind of do it within a project, anyways. So we sort of know if we're headed towards a goal, we know that we've got to kind of follow the inner movement if we're going to find our way there. It's rarely linear, but the fact that you can actually let your whole life be created that way sometimes is bigger than what most people envision living a guided life might look like.
Yeah, it can mean a lot of things to different people, right? One thing living a guided life means to me is listening, is paying attention and noticing where I feel guided naturally and what feels like the most exciting choice, where the most clarity comes in, and I feel the most relaxed making the choice. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm in my comfort zone, though. I'd love to hear more about your view of living a guided life, what that looks like.
Well, the funny thing, just quickly, is that it also doesn't necessarily mean you're outside your comfort zone. The comfort zone becomes a whole different thing. It's not a navigational tool. It's just a point of interest. Oh, I'm uncomfortable about this. Oh, I find this easy. It's kind of like, sometimes I wear a red T-shirt, sometimes I wear a blue T-shirt. I think the listening piece is huge, though. Listening makes it sound sometimes, I think, like it's a voice inside, and it isn't for a lot of people, but it is an inner sense of direction. And I remember for me, the first time I really saw it, I used to do a process every year for myself and with my clients called Best Year Yet. And it's based on a lovely book written by a woman named Ginny Ditzler called Your Best Year Yet. And you'd set your 10 goals for the year, and you'd do monthly reviews. And, it's a very linear mathematical kind of a process. And one year I noticed at the end of January that I had done some stuff on my 10 goals, but that there was this whole other path that my life was taking that was nothing to do with them. And it was just kind of what I was doing in my spare time. It was what was happening anyways. And I got really interested in the difference between these two paths, the paths I had laid out and was trying to make happen, and the path that was laying itself out step by step so naturally that I didn't necessarily even feel like I was on it. And I kind of followed that through that year, and I began to see there is always what I call a path of the soul. There is always an unfolding if you're willing to wait for it to unfold, because it's just like a beat later than the one you make up in your head. It's not like wait for it for 10 years. It's you get to the end of everything you know, and then there's a pause where you feel like there's nothing else, and that's when it shows up.
I really resonate with that in for me, one of the most recent times that was in my life was when Kamala came into my life. You know, a lot of you guys here at Thriving Launch know, enough about my story now that you've gotten the gist that I met Kamala at a point where it seemed like everything had broken down and I just didn't know where to take life anymore. I had degrees. I had a wonderful job. I had lost a job. I had ended, what was an amazing relationship that, had run its time, and got to kind of a place where I just didn't know where to take life, and sat there for nearly a year, unsure. Kamala shows up, whisks me off, and really opens up the gateways to these other possibilities. And it wasn't the way that I envisioned my life going, but it was the way that I felt inspired to go. Like something about it was right. And as I, think about what you're saying and think about that experience and other experiences in life, I'm curious, do you think that we always have to get to this kind of breaking point to have that turning point where it's like, oh, I'm being guided because I know nothing anymore, and so there's really nothing left? Is it possible to somehow cultivate or find that silence? I don't know what it is really, right? Because it feels like such a vague thing.
I think people often do find it when they've kind of done as much as they can do. And then again, there's that pause where it's like, well, I've done everything I know to do. But it's not a prerequisite. It's just that most of us are so sure the answer's in our heads that it's not till we exhaust our own will and our own head that we find it. For me, one of the metaphors I use for it is it's like getting a taste for good wine. Like if you drink cheap wine, and my wife and I did for years because we were students and that's what we could afford. Like you don't really notice. You just, this is fine. This is great. But then you have really good wine and you see it's a whole different thing. It has flavor to it, and it has richness to it, and it doesn't give you a hangover, and it's this whole other thing. And then you kind of know you can't go back to drinking the cheap stuff. Like when you start to recognize where your inner sense of direction is taking you, and how beautiful that unfolding is compared to your best efforts, you kind of lose your taste for your own will, and you really develop a taste for this sort of dance with life that is always there. There's an old saying attributed to Nietzsche that those who danced were thought insane by those who could not hear the music. When you're living a guided life, you're dancing to an inner music, and like with music, you don't know what's happening next. But when you're really in the dance, you don't need to know because you're just moving with the music as it plays. And that dance is, for me, one of the most thrilling experiences that's available to us in our lives. And by some beautiful kindness of the design, it seems to take us to the perfect place again and again and again.
I've likened this to walking through a door that you can't come back through. Once you've lived or decided to live life with that listening and with the guidance and that inner knowing that is propelling you forward, you can't really go back. I think fortunately or unfortunately you can. It's just that you kind of when you go back, you feel a bit lost because there's something missing. That cheap wine just doesn't taste as sweet.
You can absolutely go back to cheap wine. It's just no fun anymore.
When my first experience of this was when I was 15, hitchhiking around the United States. It was 1999, and I had no idea where I was going to go. We just basically went wherever the ride would take us. And for me, that experience was really important because it really showed me how just following the flow and following that inner guidance was so important for safety, for manifesting, for creating incredible experiences and attracting things. And I remember waking up one morning from a dream that we got picked up by a school bus, and I thought, well, that's a strange dream. And then we got dropped off right in front of a prison where it said, no, do not pick up hitchhikers for the next 100 miles. And I thought, we're going to be out in the middle of the desert with no ride. But circumstances happen where the next thing happened, we got picked up by a school bus. And so, that magic can really happen when we do follow that guidance.
Well, and I think it's interesting. I love that. I have stories like that. I love it when it happens like that. And I think sometimes we wait for it to look magical and we don't notice that it's there in the ordinary moments too. It's there in deciding to have a cup of coffee versus a cup of tea. It's there in, for some reason, striking up a conversation with somebody at a bus stop or in a coffee shop when normally you wouldn't. It can be seemingly completely innocuous, or it can be seemingly magical and miraculous. But in every case, you're just going with what you know to do. You're going with what occurs to you in the moment. And rather than making you into some kind of impulsive, spacey, unreliable person, you can do all that within the structure and basic reliability of making and keeping agreements that kind of make the world go round. It's just you do that, where it's fundamentally coming from is different.
One question I hear people asking about this is, how do I know I'm listening to that inner guidance and that inner knowing versus just operating out of fear or operating out of my head? People I've seen have this trouble deciphering.
Yeah, and that is the most common question. And there is a pretty reliable answer, which is that if you're feeling out of sorts, confused, worked up, scared, uncomfortable, angry, that's not wisdom. Like, that's what our thinking feels like. If there's a sense of expansiveness, of ease, of well-being, of clarity, of almost not having a decision to make, you're just almost doing it because why wouldn't you? That's what our wisdom feels like. I wrote a line in my first book, which was that the still small voice within doesn't think you suck.
I like that. One of the things that comes up for me is, and you and Kamala are really starting to touch on it, is, if you're a parent, you're running a business, or you've got a job and you got all these different things, and you do have to maintain some sort of schedule and regularity about your life. You touched on that. I'm curious though too, have you found, are there some things that we can do that kind of help cultivate that space that will allow you to tune in and listen to that guidance? Are there things that you do in your life that allow you to tap into that, to make sure that you're not, just overwhelmed with the voices in your head or with the demands of life or the external kind of things that pull you away from that?
Well, I know it wasn't a deliberate setup, but I did write a book called The Space Within, where that's exactly what I talk about at length. But in a nutshell.
I think Luis knew that. I think he.
all right. Sort of, I just saying. But in a nutshell, the space is already there. We fill it up with noise. So no, I don't have any particular practices, but I do know that my life works better when I'm in touch with that space inside myself. So I am drawn towards that inner quiet. I'm drawn towards that inner spaciousness. I'm less inclined to fill it up with, more Facebook posts, more, even books. It's not about being online or offline, but it's just like there's a certain point at which if you fill yourself up from the outside, you don't have any bandwidth left for what's inside. If you spend all your time reading books, you don't have time to read consciousness.
There's really something to say about cultivating a rich internal life, and that when we create that quiet and that space, it's amazing what kind of company you can keep when you quiet down all the voices. And I think one of the reasons for reaching for excess input from other people or media is because we don't want to hear what's going on inside our own heads. And that actually adds to the noise going outside.
Yeah, and I don't want to imply that you need to go on an information fast. I think actually most people could do with at least some intermittent fasting, but it's not a full either or. But if you don't if you haven't explored the inner library, it doesn't matter how full your outer library is. And I say this as somebody who's read over 2,000 business books, personal development books, spiritual books. I love books. I write books. And there's a certain point at which you have to stop looking outside you and you have to start listening to this real-time wisdom that we all have inside us.
I'd love to hear just a little bit more what that looks like, what that feels like, so we can really bring the thriving launchers into that experience.
Well, this is the difficult or funny thing about it is it doesn't necessarily look like anything because it's an internal experience. But in a very simple way, when you get up from your desk and go to make a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom or go to do something other than what you've been doing, that if you drop into yourself, when you stop engaging with activity, if you come back home to yourself, you've got time in your day to tune in regardless of how busy you are. But what most of us do is the activity never stops. So as soon as we get up from our computer, we're in our heads about the next thing. And then we, while we're making the cup of tea, we're working on the next thing. And then, while we're brushing our teeth, we're reading the book and working on the business plan. And then we're back online. And so it's not necessarily that you have to have periods of reflection, though most people I know do wind up getting a little bit more reflective and more contemplative in their lives. It's more a case of just recognizing that's where your bread is buttered. Like what you're looking for is in the quiet between the thoughts. It's not in the habitual thoughts themselves.
I love what you just said, and I really connect to it because this morning I got up, and one of the things that it's something I'm working to not do as often is I reach for my phone in the morning. That's one of the first things that I do. And this morning I woke up and was like, okay, I'm telling myself I'm not going to do that. And I've been doing this for the past few days, kind of weave in and out of this habit. And this morning I thought, I'm just going to kind of close my eyes and think of a few things that I feel really grateful for and just breathe for a moment. So I did that. And then, I did a few other things. Then I went to my computer and my phone and I started opening up all these tabs and doing the things with the social media and the email and work-related things. And I started thinking, man, it's so hard for me to actually get any work done this way because I have all these windows open and all these things in my head going on to do this, do that, do this, do that. And so I shut all the stuff down. I closed my eyes again and thought, productivity for me is probably slower than I think about it right now. So I'm going to slow down. So slowed down for a moment, took a few deep breaths, opened up and focused on one task. And as I went through that process, now this is information that I already know, but I consistently have to come back to the basics of life and the things that I've realized. It's not a one-time realization. I come back to these things. And so I focused on one thing. And as I finished that, I was like, oh, so much easier when I just give space to that one thing, work on it, take a little moment, switch to the next thing. And it's so much easier for me to feel fulfilled because that moment was filled instead of like trying to kind of scatter it.
There's something I really want to pick up on in what you're saying, Luis, because it's the missing piece for so many people with this. You don't have to have a list of things to do instead. It occurred to you, you know what? I'm not going to grab my phone first thing. It then occurred to you, I need to take a few deep breaths. I'm going to think of some things I'm grateful for. Later, it occurred to you, hey, one thing. We already know, our inner wisdom, our inner knowing already knows how to be more productive, how to live more of an inside-out, inner-directed, guided life. And it's continually telling us in real time. You don't have to have a checklist because as you go, that very inner voice that had it occur to you to not check your phone, to focus on just one thing, to breathe deep and think of things that you were grateful for, that is always on and always inside you like a homing mechanism. And you can rely on it. And that's the interesting thing is the more you rely on it, the more reliable it is.
I love that. It really reminds me of one of the interviews. Nirmala, that I did with Nirmala. And one of the things that he talked about is this kind of spontaneous realization or life occurring in the moment, and being very present and being led to, oh, this is what's next and this is what's next. And we can still have plans, but leaving space for that other part of ourselves that is ever present and moving moment by moment, and moving with that, even within a context of scheduling. So that,
well, that's actually, with apologies, but that something Kamala said that actually I say it doesn't look like anything, but I can actually say, like, one of the things that looks like in my business is we have to book things sometimes a year to 18 months in advance. But instead of trying to plan out a year ahead or plan out 18 months ahead, we now look to have my schedule about 40 to 50% set a year out, because we need a certain amount of structure. We need a certain amount of things in place to maintain a business of the size and scope that we've got. But we know that what comes up along the way is often richer and more alive and more perfect than what we could plan. So we do very deliberately, yes, we set things out into the future, but we also leave lots of space for things to arise.
Thank you so much, Michael Neill. I really appreciate the reflection that you've given me today, the reflection that you've given all of us here at Thriving Launch. Just in this dialogue, in this conversation and chat, I feel like a part of me kind of came home more into myself, relaxed, slowed down, was very here with you. I want to thank you for bringing that energy into the world, and thank you for joining us here at Thriving Launch.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Thriving Launch podcast. For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure to head over to thrivinglaunch.com.